Greetings, quiet seekers of ancient woes. Tonight, we journey to the land of pharaohs, not for glittering gold, but for their worst nightmare, the old kingdom's collapse. Imagine a society where the pharaoh, a living god, suddenly stops answering the cosmic phone. Famine and civil war reigned. It sucked so spectacularly the afterlife felt like a downgrade. If this morbid dive tickles you, like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's truly miserable history. The old kingdom of Egypt. Let's wind the timeline back to a period of supreme, almost smug confidence. From roughly 2700 to 2200 BCE, the Egyptians weren't just a civilization, they were the civilization. This was the age of the god kings, an era of such monumental construction and centralized power that they probably thought the gods were taking notes from them. They looked at the vast, unforgiving desert surrounding their thin ribbon of a river and decided to build eternity out of it. And for a while, it seemed to be working. Their project managers were top-notch, their workers were motivated by divine will, and their kings were gods. What could possibly go wrong? The entire universe, as they saw it, pivoted around one man, the pharaoh. He wasn't just a king, he was a living conduit to the divine, the human-shaped remote control for the cosmos. As long as Pharaoh was happy, healthy, and performing the correct rituals, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and the crops would grow. The stability of everything rested on his shoulders. The Great Pyramids at Giza weren't just fancy tombs, they were colossal monuments to this idea. They were stone-carved insurance policies designed to guarantee that the king's power would continue to stabilize the universe even after his death. The whole system was divinely foolproof, or so the brochure said. This grand cosmic bargain had a name, Maat. It was the concept of truth, balance, order, and justice. Maat was the divine rhythm of the universe, and it was every Egyptian's duty, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest farmer, to live in accordance with it. To defy Maat was to invite Isfet, chaos, into the world. For centuries, this system was their bedrock. They built their society upon this single, elegant idea. If we do everything right, everything will be right. Forever, they believed they had hacked the universe, found the source code for eternal stability, and were building a civilization that would simply never end. But here's the thing about forever, it has a tendency to overstay its welcome. Even the grandest designs can be undone by the fine print. While the Egyptians were busy quarrying limestone and aligning their tombs with the stars, a few foundational cracks were beginning to show. They were so focused on building for eternity that they failed to notice the present was developing some serious structural issues. They thought they were building a permanent home on a mountain of granite. They were about to discover they had actually built a sandcastle just as the tide was coming in. Turns out, forever had an expiration date, and the universe was about to call in their tab. For one, those pyramids were spectacularly, ruinously expensive. Think of them not as buildings but as economic black holes. Each one required a national effort, draining a staggering amount of food, resources, and manpower for decades. And it didn't stop when the pyramid was finished. Each dead king required a permanent cult, a dedicated staff of priests, and a stream of offerings to keep his spirit happy and the cosmos in balance. After generations of this, Egypt was essentially supporting a shadow government of very demanding ghosts. The country's economy was becoming a feature-length sequel to its own funeral, and the living were starting to feel the pinch. While the pharaohs in the capital of Memphis were commissioning ever grander monuments to their own immortality, power was quietly trickling away to the provinces. Local governors, known as Nomarks, were gaining more and more autonomy. At first, they were loyal servants of the king, but as the central government became more preoccupied with its celestial retirement plans, these nomarchs started carving out their own little kingdoms. They built their own fancy tombs, controlled local armies, and passed their power down to their sons. They started to see the pharaoh less as a god and more as a distant, increasingly irrelevant landlord. Adding a touch of morbid absurdity to the situation was Pharaoh Pepi II. He ascended to the throne as a child, and then proceeded to not die for a very, very long time. His reign is one of the longest in human history, possibly stretching over 90 years. While that sounds impressive, it was a disaster. He outlived his own children, his grandchildren, and probably his own will to live. Imagine a god-king so ancient that his authority just evaporates from old age. His long, slow decline mirrored the decay of the state itself, creating a power vacuum and a succession crisis that nobody had planned for. The symbol of divine stability had become a symbol of stagnation. And then came the final, most unforgivable betrayal. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, the one constant they could always rely on, decided to take an unscheduled, century-long vacation. A drastic shift in global climate led to a series of catastrophically low floods. The predictable, life-giving inundation failed year after year. The fertile black land turned to dust. Famine swept through the kingdom, a famine so severe that it shattered the very foundations of their faith. If the Pharaoh could no longer make the Nile rise, then what good was he? The gods, it seemed, had stopped answering. Chaos, the dreaded Isfet, was no longer a threat. It was here. To understand why ancient Egypt collapsed so spectacularly, we first need to understand the magnificent, terrifying, and frankly absurd belief system that held it together. It was a society built on a single, unwavering foundation. The king was not just a ruler, he was a god on earth, not a representative of the gods or a man chosen by the gods, but an actual walking, breathing deity with the most stressful job description in human history. His divine performance review determined the fate of the entire world. This wasn't a system with checks and balances, it was a cosmic one-man show. Imagine the pressure. The ancient Egyptian pharaoh was personally responsible for making the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening. It was his duty to ensure the great Nile River flooded its banks each year, depositing the rich black silt that made agriculture possible. The growth of the crops, the health of the livestock, the turning of the seasons, all of it was tied directly to his sacred power and his ritual correctness. No pressure, of course, but if you happened to sneeze at the wrong moment during a critical ritual, the sun might just decide to give up for the day. This absolute faith was their greatest strength and their most catastrophic vulnerability. At the heart of this worldview was the concept of the pharaoh as the living embodiment of the god Horus, the majestic falcon-headed deity of the sky and kingship. Upon his death, the pharaoh would mystically transform and merge with Osiris, the god of the underworld, eternal life and regeneration. The new pharaoh, his successor, would then immediately become the new Horus. This divine cycle of death and rebirth was the engine of the state, a celestial relay race that ensured the continuity of the cosmos itself. The king wasn't just wearing the crown, he was the crown, a sacred link in an unbreakable divine chain. To be pharaoh was to be the son of Ra, the great sun god who created all things. This wasn't just a fancy title to put on a business card, it was a literal statement of his lineage and his power. As Ra's child, he was the only being on earth who could properly commune with the gods. Priests in the countless temples across Egypt acted only as the king's proxies. Every prayer, every offering, every puff of incense that curled towards the heavens was done in his name and through his authority. He was the sole intermediary between the chaotic human world and the perfect orderly realm of the gods. He was the universe's divine switchboard operator. This cosmic responsibility had a name, Ma'at. Ma'at was the fundamental order of the universe. It was truth, justice, harmony, balance, and righteousness all rolled into one. It was the natural state of things, the way the world was supposed to work. Ma'at was the sun moving across the sky, the stars rotating in their predictable patterns, the river flooding and receding with comforting regularity. It was a universe running on a perfect, divine program. The pharaoh's job, his entire reason for being, was to be the chief programmer, ensuring that the code of Ma'at was never, ever broken. The alternative was simply too horrifying to contemplate. The opposite of Ma'at was a terrifying concept known as Isfet. Isfet was chaos. It was injustice, violence, lies, and decay. Isfet was the desert encroaching on the fertile fields. It was foreign invasion, it was disease, it was social unrest, and, most terribly of all, it was the failure of the Nile. Isfet wasn't just a bad day, it was the unraveling of reality itself. The struggle between Ma'at and Isfet was the central drama of the Egyptian universe, and the pharaoh was the protagonist, standing on the front lines, holding back the tide of cosmic horror with his daily rituals and divine presence. A single misstep could invite chaos to dinner. And this wasn't a part-time gig. The pharaoh's life was a relentless series of rituals to uphold Ma'at. From the moment he woke, he was engaged in sacred duties. There were daily ceremonies in his private palace temples, where he would ritually wash, anoint, and feed the cult statues of the gods, an act only he could perform correctly. He presided over massive national festivals, laid the foundation stones for new temples, and was the supreme judge of the land, as his laws were considered a reflection of divine justice. Being a god-king was less about lounging on a throne and more about being the universe's busiest and most stressed-out civil servant. His power was, in theory, absolute. Every scrap of land in Egypt belonged to him. The entire population were his servants. The immense wealth of the nation, its mines, its farms, its trade routes, was all his personal property to be managed for the good of the cosmos. This centralized power allowed for the mobilization of the entire country to achieve incredible feats, from building the pyramids to waging war. In the Old Kingdom, this system worked like a dream. The pharaoh's authority was unquestioned, his wealth seemed limitless, and the monuments he raised were a testament to a society in perfect harmony with its beliefs. The Egyptians saw this harmony everywhere. They believed their land was a mirror image of the heavens, a sacred geography protected by the gods. The Nile Valley was Kemet, the Black Land, a place of order and life. The surrounding deserts were Dehret, the Red Land, a realm of chaos and death. Their entire world was a physical manifestation of the struggle between Ma'at and Isfet. This duality reinforced their belief that they were a chosen people living in a divinely ordered bubble, protected from the howling chaos outside by the strength and piety of their king. It was a comforting, if deeply fragile, worldview. This belief system demanded tangible proof. If the pharaoh was successfully maintaining Ma'at, there should be evidence, and the ultimate proof, the annual performance review for the god-king, was the Nile's inundation, a perfect flood, not too high to be destructive, not too low to cause drought, was a sign that the gods were pleased, the pharaoh was doing his job correctly, and another year of Ma'at was guaranteed. And scribes would carefully measure the height of the flood on nilometers, and the measurement would be announced to the entire country. It was the nation's annual report card from the cosmos. Imagine the collective sigh of relief when the waters rose just right. The pharaoh's divine power was affirmed. The bureaucracy could calculate the year's taxes, and the farmers knew they would have a bountiful harvest. It was a sign that all was right with the world. But this dependency created a deep-seated national anxiety. What if the waters didn't rise? What if they rose too much? Any deviation from the norm wasn't just an agricultural problem. It was a theological crisis. It was a terrifying whisper that the pharaoh might be failing, that the gods were displeased, that the forces of Isfet were winning. This whole structure of belief was, in essence, a massive, countrywide gamble on the king's divinity. The Egyptian people had placed all their faith in this single extraordinary concept. The stability of their lives, the food on their tables, the very meaning of their existence was subcontracted out to the man on the throne. This worked wonderfully when times were good. It fostered a profound sense of unity, purpose, and confidence that fueled the Old Kingdom's golden age. But it also meant there was no plan B, there was no backup system. There was only the pharaoh. If a modern government fails, you can vote it out. If a company fails, it goes bankrupt. But what do you do when your god fails? Who do you complain to when the living incarnation of Horus, the son of Ra, can't make the rains come? The very idea was a logical and spiritual impossibility. To question the pharaoh was to question the sun, the stars, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. It was to invite chaos. So for centuries, they didn't question. They built bigger tombs and more glorious temples, doubling down on their faith. This is the fragile foundation upon which the Old Kingdom stood. It was an intricate house of cards, built from faith, ritual, and the predictable flow of the river. The Egyptians were not naive. They were brilliant engineers, architects, and administrators, but their scientific and practical knowledge was completely interwoven with their theology. They didn't see a distinction between the physical and the divine. The world was a magical place, run by magical rules, and the pharaoh was the chief magician. So when we look at the monumental pyramids, we shouldn't just see them as tombs. We should see them as expressions of this profound and risky belief. They were a desperate attempt to make the pharaoh's power permanent, to lock in his ability to maintain Ma'at for all time. They were stone anchors, meant to hold the ship of state steady in the cosmic currents forever. Each block was a prayer, each chamber a safeguard, each inscription a spell to ensure the system would never fail. The Egyptians built for millions of years, for eternity. The very concept of their civilization ending was unthinkable, a contradiction in terms. The pharaoh was eternal, his power was eternal, and therefore Egypt was eternal. This supreme confidence was born from centuries of stability and prosperity. They had no reason to believe things would ever change. They saw themselves as the central, unchanging point in a chaotic world, the pinnacle of creation. They were masters of their world, secure in their bubble of divine order. They had built a system that seemed perfect, a society that reflected the flawless design of the heavens. The God-King was on his throne, the priests were in their temples, and the people were in their fields. Everything was in its right place. But the cosmos has a dark sense of humor, the very foundation of their world. The absolute, unquestionable power and responsibility of a single man was about to become the very thing that would tear it all apart. The system was designed for success, not for failure. It had no tolerance for error. There was no room for a king to be merely human, or for the Nile to be anything but perfectly reliable. This lack of flexibility, this all-or-nothing investment in a single point of failure, was the fatal flaw hidden in plain sight. For 500 years the foundation held, the kings were strong, the river was predictable, and Ma'at was secure. But the cracks were beginning to form, deep in the bedrock of their faith. The pharaoh was the keystone in the arch of Egyptian civilization. As long as the keystone remained solid, the arch would stand for eternity. But if that keystone were to crumble, from internal decay, from external pressure, or from the sheer crushing weight of its own impossible responsibility, the entire structure would collapse into ruin. And that is precisely what was about to happen. The greatest power in the ancient world was about to learn a brutal lesson in humility. They believed the pharaonic system was a direct line to the gods, a guarantee of cosmic favor. It was the source of their strength, their wealth, and their identity. They would soon discover that their divine connection had a terrible downside. When the gods seem to be on your side, life is good. But when that divine connection seems to be failing, when the line goes dead, the silence is terrifying. The Egyptians were about to enter a period of profound, deafening silence. The pharaoh held the universe in his hands. It was a belief that had built the pyramids and sustained a civilization for centuries. But a belief can be a fragile thing. What happens when the hands that hold the universe begin to tremble? What happens when a god appears to be powerless? The people of the Old Kingdom were about to find out, and the answer would plunge their world into an apocalypse of their own making. The job of being a god was proving to be much harder than it looked. The weight of the sun, the moon, and the river was a heavy burden for one man to bear. The cosmic balance was delicate, and it didn't take much to tip the scales. A weak king, a greedy governor, or a stubborn climate was all it would take to push their perfect world over the edge. The system's greatest strength was about to become its most fatal weakness. The Egyptians thought their foundation was made of solid granite, divinely quarried from the heavens. In reality, it was more like glass. For centuries it was beautiful, strong, and reflected the light of the gods perfectly. But it was also rigid and brittle. It could not bend. It could only shatter, and the first hairline fractures were already spreading, signaling the end of an era. The great, forgotten apocalypse of ancient Egypt was about to begin. Of all the pillars holding up the grand edifice of Old Kingdom Egypt, none was more critical than the river. The Nile wasn't just a source of water, it was the civilization's source code, its engine, its clock, and its god. For millennia, it had been the one thing the Egyptians could count on, a benevolent, predictable deity that delivered life on a schedule. Its annual flood was the pulse of the nation. But around the year 2200 BCE, that pulse began to weaken. The reliable god of the river was about to ghost an entire civilization, proving that the most terrifying apocalypse doesn't always come with fire and brimstone. Sometimes it's just dry. We've talked about the immense fragile ego of the pharaonic state, the belief that one man's ritual correctness kept the universe from falling apart. But that belief was propped up by the Nile's comforting predictability. It's easy to believe your king is a god when the fields are fertile and the granaries are full. But the Egyptian gods, it seems, were about to run a little experiment. What happens if we take away the water? The answer, as the Old Kingdom was about to discover, was that their whole society was built on a promise the river was no longer willing to keep. Turns out, a river is a terrible thing to lose, especially when your entire civilization depends on it. To understand the catastrophe, you have to understand the miracle of the annual inundation. Every year, from roughly June to September, the Nile would swell with monsoon rains from the distant Ethiopian highlands. It would surge over its banks, flooding the narrow valley and the wide delta. This wasn't a destructive flood, it was a welcome guest. The Egyptians called this season Akhet, the time of inundation. For 3 months, much of the farmland was underwater, a vast, placid lake shimmering under the Egyptian sun. It was a time of waiting, of patience, of faith in the cycle. This watery slumber was the essential first act of their survival. When the waters began to recede in October, they left behind a gift of almost supernatural value, a fresh, thick layer of rich black silt. This soil, packed with nutrients carried from thousands of miles away, was unbelievably fertile. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, the Black Land, in its honor. This annual or natural fertilization meant they didn't have to worry about crop rotation or soil depletion. The river did all the work. All they had to do was walk onto the newly exposed, damp earth and plant their seeds. The system was so brilliantly efficient, so perfectly adapted to their world, it must have felt like a divine guarantee. Their entire agricultural system, a method called basin irrigation, was designed around this gift. They built a network of earthen walls to trap the floodwaters in large basins. As the water soaked into the earth, it prepared the ground for the peret, the growing season. They would sow wheat and barley, the staples of their diet, with minimal effort. The harvest, or shem, would follow, providing enough food to feed the populace, pay the legions of bureaucrats and pyramid builders, and stock the state granaries against the possibility of a single bad year. For centuries, this rhythm was as certain as the sunrise. It was a system of beautiful simplicity and terrifying dependency. The Egyptians had no other source of water. The rains almost never fell in their desert home. Without the annual flood, the Black Land would cease to be black. The fertile soil would be baked by the sun, cracked and barren, indistinguishable from the hostile red land of the desert that surrounded them. Their entire civilization, their food, their wealth, their power, their art, their faith, was built on a few feet of miraculous mud. They were balanced on a knife's edge, and the knife was the river. Then the unthinkable happened. The floods began to fail. We now know this wasn't the Pharaoh's fault, despite what his subjects may have thought. It was a massive, prolonged climate event, known to scientists as the 4.2 kiloyear aridification event. A sudden global cooling seems to have shifted weather patterns, weakening the African monsoons that fed the Nile's sources. For Egypt, the result was catastrophic. The life-giving surge of water from the south slowed to a trickle. The reliable god of the river had fallen silent. At first, it must have been a source of quiet anxiety. The scribes at the Nilometers, the stone gauges used to measure the flood's peak, would have reported the bad news to the palace. The flood was low, not disastrously low perhaps, but low enough to cause concern. The priests would have redoubled their rituals, the pharaoh would have made more offerings, and everyone would have hoped it was a one-time fluke. But then it happened again the next year, and the next. The fluke was becoming a trend, and the trend was becoming a death sentence. The years of low floods turned into decades of crippling drought. The vast shimmering lake of the Isfet season shrank. The waters no longer reached the higher fields, leaving them barren and useless. The layer of revitalizing silt grew thin, or in some places vanished entirely. The canals that crisscrossed the floodplain, designed to manage the once mighty flood, became ditches of dust. The black land itself, the very heart of Egypt, began to shrink, starved of the water that was its lifeblood. The desert, the realm of chaos, began to reclaim what it had lost. Imagine the landscape changing before your eyes, the vibrant green of the growing season becoming a sickly yellow-brown, the once impenetrable fields of papyrus reeds, the source of their paper, withering away, the river itself, the mighty artery of the nation, becoming shallow and sluggish, a sad shadow of its former glory. For a people who saw their land as a mirror of divine order, this transformation must have been horrifying. It looked as if the world itself was dying, as if the forces of Isfet were winning a slow, agonizing war of attrition. The state granaries, the buffer against hard times, began to empty. For generations they had stored vast surpluses of grain, the tangible wealth of the kingdom. This grain paid for everything, the army, the bureaucracy, the monumental construction projects. Now, with harvest after harvest failing, the reserves dwindled. The central government, which had once seemed limitlessly powerful, suddenly found its primary currency, food, was disappearing. It's hard to project an aura of divine authority when your people are starving and you can't pay your employees. The famine that followed was unlike anything Egypt had ever known. We have heartbreaking inscriptions from this period that paint a grim picture. They speak of hunger, of desperation, of the complete breakdown of social norms. The Admonitions of Ipuwer, a text from a slightly later period but likely describing the trauma of this collapse, speaks of a world turned upside down. The river is blood, it laments, possibly a poetic description of the red, silt-filled but miserably low water, or perhaps the chaos and violence that ensued. The texts describe horrific scenes, people eating their own children, the rich becoming poor and the poor becoming rich through plunder, the dead being thrown into the river for lack of proper burial, tomb robbery becoming rampant as people sought any valuables to trade for a mouthful of grain. This wasn't just a famine, it was the dissolution of Ma'at itself. Every rule of their ordered society was being broken out of sheer, desperate hunger. The cosmic order had failed, and raw survival was all that was left. One powerful inscription from a provincial governor named Ankhtifi, who ruled in the south during this time, boasts that he kept his own district fed while the rest of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger. He chillingly adds, "I saw people who had to eat their own children." While he portrays himself as a hero, his text reveals the grim reality. The central government had collapsed, and Egypt had shattered into a collection of local fiefdoms ruled by warlords who controlled the last remaining scraps of food. Power no longer flowed from the pharaoh, but from whoever held the keys to the local grain silo. What was the god-king in Memphis doing while his country starved? He was, for the first time in centuries, utterly and completely helpless. No amount of ritual could make the African monsoons return. No divine utterance could fill the canals. The pharaoh, the man whose job was to guarantee the flood, was proven to be powerless. The central pillar of their faith, the idea that a man could control the forces of nature, was being ground into dust under the relentless Egyptian sun. The king had no clothes, and worse, he had no water. The psychological impact must have been profound. It was a crisis of faith on a national scale. The gods were silent. The pharaoh was a failure. The world was not the orderly, predictable place they had believed it to be. The covenant between man, king, and the gods had been broken, and the result was chaos, death, and hunger. The very foundations of their identity were dissolving, leaving them adrift in a hostile, meaningless world. It was a spiritual apocalypse to match the physical one. This environmental catastrophe was the primary catalyst that sent the Old Kingdom into a death spiral. It exacerbated every other problem that had been slowly developing. The economic strain from pyramid building became unbearable when the state's income, grain, vanished. The growing power of provincial nomarks exploded as they became the sole providers for their desperate populations, severing their loyalty to a distant and ineffective king. The fragile foundation of the pharaoh's divine authority simply crumbled. The failure of the Nile didn't just cause a famine, it delegitimized the entire political and religious system of the Old Kingdom. It exposed the central premise of their civilization, the divinity and power of the pharaoh, as a fragile belief that only held up when the weather was good. It was a lesson written in dust and hunger, a lesson that would haunt the Egyptian psyche for centuries to come. The mighty kingdom of the pyramid builders had been brought to its knees, not by a foreign army, but by a change in the weather. The world they knew had ended. The era of supreme confidence, of building for eternity, was over. The Egyptians had looked upon their works and their perfect world and believed it would last forever. But they forgot that their whole world was balanced on the flow of a single river, a river whose sources lay 1,000 miles away, far beyond their control. They had outsourced their survival to a force of nature, and nature had just revoked their contract. The dry days were long and miserable. The once mighty Nile had said nope, and in doing so, it had passed a death sentence on an entire era. The silence of the river was the loudest sound in Egypt, a roaring emptiness that drowned out the prayers of the priests and the commands of the king. The great, forgotten apocalypse was not an act of war, but an act of withdrawal. The water simply went away, and it took the Old Kingdom with it. It is a chillingly modern tale in a way, a story of a civilization whose prosperity was inextricably linked to a stable climate. When that climate changed, their intricate social and political structures, which had seemed so robust, proved to be terrifyingly brittle. The Egyptians learned the hard way that no matter how magnificent your temples are, you can't eat stone and you can't drink faith. The great pyramids, symbols of their eternal power, now stood as ironic monuments over a starving, chaotic land. They were built to guarantee the pharaoh's mastery over the cosmos, but now they were just elaborate, useless tombstones for a dead era. The gods, it seemed, were not impressed. The sun still rose, but it now baked a barren, dying land. The cosmic order had been broken, and the long, dark night of the first intermediate period was falling. The river had been their greatest blessing, and its absence became their greatest curse. It had given them life, and then it had given them a slow, agonizing death. The memory of this terrible time, of the great famine and the collapse of all order, would be seared into the Egyptian soul. They would eventually recover, but they would never be the same. They had stared into the face of Isfet, and it was as dry and empty as the desert wind. With the Nile on an extended, unannounced vacation, Egypt was unwillingly enrolled in a new national program, the Great Egyptian Diet Plan. This wasn't a trendy regimen of choice, it was a mandatory, all-encompassing lifestyle change with 0 cheat days, and a single grim ingredient: nothing. The land of plenty, famous for its bountiful harvests and epic feasts depicted on tomb walls, was about to learn the true meaning of a calorie deficit. The intricate, ordered society of the Old Kingdom was about to be undone, not by an army, but by the simple, agonizing emptiness of a stomach. The irony was as thick as the dust on the barren fields. For centuries, the Egyptian afterlife was imagined as a perfect reflection of this life, complete with eternal banquets of bread, beer, roasted fowl, and sweet fruits. They spent their lives provisioning their tombs for an eternity of feasting. Now, in the land of the living, that dream of abundance had become a waking nightmare of scarcity. Forget the lavish banquets depicted in their art. Suddenly, a moldy piece of bread found in the dirt was a 5-star meal. The quest for eternal life had been replaced by a desperate, daily struggle for the next mouthful. This wasn't a famine that nipped at the edges of society, affecting only the poor. This was a complete systemic failure of the food supply. It was a terrifying equalizer. Hunger, it turns out, is unimpressed by social status. The same gnawing emptiness that tormented the farmer in his mud brick hut also echoed through the once grand villas of the high officials in Memphis. The intricate social pyramid of Egypt was about to discover that everyone gets hungry, and when a whole country gets hungry at the same time, things tend to fall apart. To grasp the horror of what they lost, we must remember what they had. The backbone of the Egyptian diet for rich and poor alike was bread and beer. They were the original carbo loaders, with dozens of types of bread, from simple flat loaves for the workers to richer sweetened cakes for the elite. Beer was a thick, nutritious porridge-like brew, consumed daily by everyone, including children. It was their primary source of calories and hydration, the liquid currency of their world. It was more than a drink, it was life itself, and the vats were running dry. The average Egyptian would supplement this with onions, garlic, lentils, and fish from the once teeming Nile. It was a simple but effective diet that fueled the builders of the pyramids. The wealthy, of course, enjoyed a more varied menu. Their tables groaned with roasted beef, goose, and duck. They had access to honey, dates, figs, and wine from sprawling estates. Food was a symbol of status, a display of wealth and Maat's blessings. It was a world of comfortable, well-fed certainty. That world was now a fading memory. As the drought dragged on, the first casualty was the surplus. The great state granaries, architectural marvels designed to store years of grain, began to look less like symbols of security and more like hollow monuments to a bygone area. The intricate system of collection and redistribution, managed by a legion of scribes, ground to a halt. There was nothing left to collect, and therefore nothing left to give. The wages of the state workers, paid in bread and beer, could no longer be met. The entire economic engine of the state seized up. Then the true hunger began, not the temporary pangs of a missed meal, but a deep, abiding, and inescapable starvation that became the new rhythm of life. It started in the countryside, with the farmers whose fields were now cracked earth. They were the first to exhaust their personal stores, the first to watch their children grow thin. Soon the hunger crept into the towns and cities, a silent, invisible plague that respected no walls and no station. The bustling markets fell silent, their stalls empty. The air once filled with the aroma of baking bread was now thick with desperation. Does a society do when the food runs out? It improvises. The Egyptian diet plan moved into its experimental phase. People began to eat things that were never intended for human consumption. We have texts from the era, cries of despair carved in stone, that give us a glimpse into the grim new menu. They speak of people eating coarse grasses from the fields, grubbing for wild roots in the dry riverbeds, and chewing on leather sandals just to have something in their mouths. The established order of food had collapsed, and now anything that could be chewed was on the table. This desperation led to a horrifying breakdown of trust. The social fabric of Mahat was built on community, on mutual obligation. The famine shredded it. Neighbors who had once shared tools and celebrated festivals together now eyed each other with suspicion. Who had a hidden stash of grain? Who had found a scrawny animal to kill? Hoarding became a capital offense not by law, but by the judgment of starving neighbors. Theft became commonplace. The world shrank to the size of one's own family and then to the size of one's own empty stomach. The texts from this period are filled with lamentations about this social inversion. The Admonitions of Ipuwer speaks of the chaos with poetic horror. He who had no grain is now the owner of granaries, it says, suggesting that violent opportunists were seizing what little was left. It speaks of noblewomen once draped in fine linen and attended by servants now ragged and desperate. She who looked at her face in the water is now owner of a slave. One line reads, while another counters, she who had a box is now on her back with a plank. The world had been turned upside down. In his tomb at Moala, the provincial warlord Unktefi bragged about his own success amidst the chaos. He paints himself as a savior, stating, "I fed my city when the whole of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger." While meant to glorify him, his words betray the horrifying reality. He admits that people had to eat their own children to survive. He likely exaggerated his benevolence. More probably, he used his military power to hoard all the grain in his region, creating an island of relative stability in a sea of starvation, and cementing his own power in the process. The grim spectre of cannibalism mentioned by Anktifi and other texts represents the ultimate collapse of Ma'at, the final taboo. While it was likely an act of utter last resort desperation rather than a common practice, the fact that it was mentioned at all shows how completely their world had unraveled. To consume another human was the greatest possible act of Isfet, a complete rejection of all human and divine order. It was a sign that Egypt had not just failed, it had devoured itself. Think of the psychological toll. Every waking moment was consumed by the quest for food. The complex theology, the grand art, the pride in their civilization, all of it would have felt like a bitter joke. What good were the magnificent pyramids when your child was crying from hunger? What comfort was a glorious tomb when your body was wasting away in the present? The promise of an eternal afterlife is cold comfort when the immediate reality is a slow, agonizing death by starvation. For the wealthy, the transition was perhaps the most jarring. One year they were attending lavish banquets, their servants presenting course after course of roasted meats and wine. The next, they were barricading their villas against starving mobs, their wealth suddenly meaningless. Gold cannot be eaten, fine linen cannot fill an empty stomach. Their entire identity was tied to their possessions and status, and the famine rendered it all worthless. The Great Diet Plan had stripped them of everything. Even the concept of a dignified burial, so central to Egyptian belief, fell by the wayside. The elaborate rituals of mummification and the careful provisioning of tombs became an impossible luxury. Texts lament that the dead were simply cast into the Nile, their bodies floating on the sluggish brown water because there was no one with the strength or the resources to bury them. This wasn't just a failure to respect the dead, it was a severing of the link to the afterlife, a condemnation of an entire generation to spiritual oblivion. This wasn't just a story or a poetic lament. We see the truth of it written in the bones of the people who survived. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletal remains from this period have found the unmistakable signs of severe, prolonged malnutrition. They see evidence of anemia etched into the skulls, lines of arrested growth on the long bones of children who went hungry, and widespread dental problems from a diet of coarse, gritty, barely edible plants. The bones don't lie. They are the silent witnesses to the Great Famine. These skeletons are the final report card for the Old Kingdom. They show a population ravaged by hunger, their bodies bearing the scars of a society that could no longer feed them. The famine wasn't just a temporary hardship, it was a biological catastrophe that left its mark on the very bones of the Egyptian people. It proves that the desperate inscriptions were not exaggerations. They were the lived reality for millions. The Great Diet Plan had succeeded in one respect. It had stripped the Old Kingdom down to its bare bones, both literally and figuratively. It had exposed the fragility of its power, the hollowness of its divine promises, and the absolute dependency it had on a single fickle river. The suffering was immense, a collective trauma that would echo through Egyptian memory for centuries to come. When a government's most basic promise, to ensure its people don't starve to death, is broken so completely it loses all legitimacy. The divine Pharaoh was shown to be just a man. The powerful state was revealed as a hollow shell. The intricate order of Ma'at was exposed as a fairy tale told in a time of plenty. Hunger had been the great unifier, and now it was the great destroyer. The survivors of this grim period were a changed people. They had witnessed the end of their world. They had seen their neighbors, their friends, and their families consumed by a slow, creeping death. They had seen the highest nobles reduced to begging, and the most sacred traditions abandoned. The confidence and optimism that had built the pyramids was gone, replaced by a deep-seated cynicism and a hard-won instinct for survival. The famine scoured the land clean, not just of people, but of illusions. The illusion of divine control, the illusion of eternal stability, and the illusion of Egyptian exceptionalism. They had learned the hard way that even the greatest civilizations are only ever a few failed harvests away from chaos. The memory of the hunger would become a permanent part of their cultural DNA. So ends the grimmest chapter in our story of the collapse. The great Egyptian diet plan had run its course, leaving behind a shattered, emaciated, and traumatized land. The physical hunger would eventually pass as the climate slowly stabilized, but the spiritual and political starvation would define the chaotic era that was to follow. The old kingdom was dead, not with a bang, but with the quiet, desperate gnawing of an empty stomach. The famine had scoured the land, and the great Egyptian diet plan had left the country weak and traumatized. But the hunger wasn't just in their stomachs, it was in their souls. The entire Old Kingdom was built on a divine contract, a sacred deal with the cosmos. The people offered absolute loyalty and labor, and in return, the Pharaoh, their god-king, guaranteed Mahat, the fundamental order of the universe. The annual Nile flood was the clearest sign this contract was being honored. Now, the divine direct deposits had stopped coming, and the people were beginning to question the management. This was the ultimate crisis of legitimacy. The pharaoh's power wasn't based on military might alone, it was based on a theological monopoly. He was the sole bridge between humanity and the gods. He was the one who made the sun rise, the crops grow, and the river flood. But when that primary function failed, a devastating question began to ripple through the starving populace. If the living God can't make the river rise, then what exactly is he good for? It was a question that would dissolve the very bedrock of the state, a question for which the pharaoh had no answer. Imagine the pharaoh's cosmic job interview. The universe is the hiring manager. The resume is impressive. Centuries of successful floods, pyramids built, enemies vanquished, but then the manager gets to the most recent work experience. It says here your primary responsibility is make river work. But we've noticed a significant multi-decade gap in river working. Can you explain this? When your whole divine mandate is based on results and the results stop coming, your resume starts to look pretty bleak. The pharaoh was about to be fired by his own people. Let's think of the Old Kingdom as Egypt Incorporated, a vast, divinely ordained corporation. The pharaoh was the chief executive officer, the living god at the top of the pyramid scheme, quite literally. The board of directors was the pantheon of gods, and the sole key performance indicator, the only metric that mattered, was the maintenance of Mahat. For 500 years, the company had posted record profits of grain and stability, but now, thanks to the catastrophic failure of its primary supplier, the Nile, Egypt Inc. was facing divine bankruptcy. The pharaoh's role in this divine corporation was non-negotiable. He was the living embodiment of the company's brand promise. The brand promise was simple: we keep chaos away. The pyramids were their colossal advertisements, the temples their regional offices, and the priesthood their sales force. But when chaos, in the form of a relentless, grinding famine, became the new normal, the brand was irrevocably damaged. The customers, also known as the Egyptian people, were losing faith in the product, and there were no refunds. This failure wasn't just abstract, it was personal, it was intimate, it was watching your child starve, while knowing that the man on the throne in Memphis, the God you were taught to worship, was either unwilling or unable to help. Faith is a powerful force, but it's hard to maintain on an empty stomach. The sacred aura that had surrounded the pharaoh for centuries began to evaporate under the harsh glare of the unforgiving sun, revealing him to be just a man, and a surprisingly ineffective one at that. We must spare a grim thought for the pharaoh himself, likely the ancient Pepi II. He had been on the throne for an eternity since he was a small child. He had inherited a kingdom at the peak of its glory, a well-oiled cosmic machine. Now, in his dotage, he was presiding over its complete dissolution. Imagine him, a frail old man, dutifully performing the ancient rituals in the gleaming temples of his capital. He makes the same gestures, says the same sacred words that had worked for his ancestors. But the gods are not picking up the celestial phone. The silence from the heavens must have been deafening. Every morning the sun would rise on a starving nation. Every year the Nile would fail to deliver its life-giving flood. The king's rituals, once seen as the very engine of the cosmos, were now revealed to be empty gestures. For a man raised to believe he was a god, this must have been a unique and profound psychological torture. He was a divine failure, a cosmic disappointment, the king who broke Egypt. His long reign became a symbol not of stability, but of decay. As the central government in the capital became paralyzed by this crisis of faith and famine, a new power was rising in the provinces. The Nomarks, the regional governors, had been growing in stature for generations. They were the local branch managers of Egypt Inc., and as the corporate headquarters in Memphis proved itself incompetent, these ambitious managers decided it was time for a hostile takeover. They saw the pharaoh's weakness not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Power, after all, abhors a vacuum, and the pharaoh was creating a vacuum of cosmic proportions. As the king failed to provide food and security, the Nomarks stepped in. A local governor who could manage his district's resources, maintain a small private army to ward off bandits and keep his people fed, even barely, was suddenly far more relevant and powerful than the distant, ineffectual god-king. Loyalty is a practical matter, and the people's loyalty began to shift from the divine concept of the Pharaoh to the man who could actually help them survive. The tomb of the warlord Ankhtifi, which we've mentioned before, is a masterclass in this shifting loyalty. His inscriptions are all about himself. I, Ankhtifi, was the beginning and the end of mankind, he boasts, a statement of breathtaking arrogance that verges on claiming divinity for himself. He talks about his own strength, his own wisdom, his own success in feeding his people. The pharaoh is mentioned only in passing, a formulaic nod to a tradition that no longer had any real meaning. Ankhtifi was his own pharaoh, in his own little kingdom. And he wasn't alone. All across Egypt, these local strongmen began to act like kings. They raised their own armies, collected their own taxes, in the form of what little grain there was, and began building their own grand tombs, once a prerogative reserved for royalty. Egypt was splintering. The unified, monolithic state of the Old Kingdom shattered into a collection of dozens of competing city-states and petty kingdoms, each ruled by a warlord who trusted only in his own strength. The nation had dissolved into anarchy. The great pyramids at Giza and Saqqara, those ultimate symbols of centralized power and national unity, now stood as silent, colossal jokes. They were monuments to a system that no longer existed. They had been built by a state that could command the resources of the entire country, a state built on a faith that was now in ruins. As civil war raged and Egypt starved, the pyramids must have seemed like relics from a mythical, lost golden age, their geometric perfection a bitter mockery of the chaos consuming the land. This political collapse was mirrored by a religious revolution. The pharaoh's greatest source of power was his unique religious status, particularly his exclusive key to a blessed afterlife. The pyramid texts, the secret spells carved inside the Old Kingdom pyramids, were a royal privilege, a celestial roadmap for the king alone. But in the chaos of the collapse, that monopoly was broken. The secrets got out. This led to one of the most significant shifts in Egyptian history, the democratization of the afterlife. Suddenly, it wasn't just the king who could hope to become one with Osiris. Any person of sufficient means could now hire priests and scribes to write the sacred spells on the inside of their own coffins. These new texts, known as the coffin texts, offered the same promises of eternal life that were once for the pharaoh alone. Heaven was no longer an exclusive royal club. It was open to anyone who could afford the price of admission. This was the ultimate theological blow to the pharaohnate. If a common man could attain eternal life without the king's help, what was the king's ultimate purpose? The pharaoh had lost his unique selling proposition. He was no longer the sole gatekeeper to paradise. This religious shift was a quiet but profound declaration of independence from the central authority of the god-king. It was a spiritual rebellion that confirmed the political reality. The pharaoh was no longer essential. The loss of this divine monopoly was permanent. Even when Egypt was later reunified and order was restored in the Middle Kingdom, the pharaoh would never again hold the same absolute, unquestioned divine authority that his Old Kingdom predecessors had enjoyed. The memory of the failure was too deep, the knowledge that a king could fail, that the gods could be silent, and that a man had to secure his own afterlife had changed the country forever. The trauma of the collapse forced a new, more cynical and more human understanding of the world. So the pharaoh's folly was not one of active malevolence, but one of passive failure. He failed to hold back the chaos, he failed to make the river rise, he failed to feed his people. In doing so, he failed to be a god. And in a system where being a god was the only job requirement, failure was not an option. The loss of legitimacy was total and absolute. The sacred cloak of divinity had been stripped away, revealing the fragile, mortal man beneath. The people of Egypt had looked at their king and seen the universe. Now they looked at him and saw only a man presiding over a wasteland of dust and hunger. The awe that had fueled their civilization was replaced by a mixture of pity, contempt, and indifference. The central pillar of their world had crumbled, and the entire structure came crashing down with it. This is the political heart of the apocalypse, the severing of the connection between the people and their king. The pharaoh became irrelevant. The grand pronouncements from the palace in Memphis were ignored by the warlords in the provinces, who were busy fighting their own battles and feeding their own people. Egypt had become a body without a head, twitching and spasming in the throes of civil war. The symbols of kingship, the crowns, the scepters, the grand titles, remained. But they were now hollow props in a play that no one was watching anymore. The authority they represented had vanished, blown away like dust in the dry wind. The pharaoh was a king of nothing, a god of a faith that had died of thirst. And so, the old kingdom officially ended, not on a specific date, not with a single decisive battle, but with the slow, agonizing fizzle of its central authority. It died in the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people, who had learned the hard way that you cannot trust a god who can't even manage a simple river. The loss of faith was the final blow, the one from which the old system could never recover. As the pharaoh's divine authority crumbled and his government in Memphis became little more than a suggestion box, a new power was stirring in the provinces. Nature abhors a vacuum, and politics abhors it even more. The old kingdom's meticulously centralized state was collapsing, and into that power vacuum stepped a caste of ambitious, opportunistic, and suddenly very powerful local officials. The Nomarks. They were the regional governors, the king's administrators in the provinces, and they were about to stage the world's first, and perhaps most chaotic, corporate takeover. The situation was spiraling out of control. The god-king was failing, the famine was raging, and the state had ceased to provide even the most basic services. For the Nomarks, this wasn't just a crisis, it was a career opportunity. They saw the king's failure as their moment to shine, or at the very least, to survive. It was a simple, brutal calculation. They could either remain loyal to a sinking ship in the distant capital, or they could seize control of their own local lifeboat. They chose the lifeboats. Imagine if every mayor and county executive suddenly decided they were king. It got messy. This wasn't an organized rebellion with a clear goal. It was a slow, organic disintegration of authority, a nationwide shrugging of shoulders. The central government had breached its contract, so the Nomarks simply stopped honoring their end of the deal. The flow of grain and tax revenue that had nourished the capital for centuries slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether. The arteries of the kingdom were severed, and the heart, the pharaoh in his palace, was left to wither. Egypt was no longer a unified nation. It was a free-for-all. To understand how radical this was, we need to remember what a nomarch was supposed to be. In the glory days of the Old Kingdom, the nomarch was the king's man, a high-ranking civil servant appointed by the crown. His job was to oversee his nome, or province, as an extension of the pharaoh's will. He managed the local irrigation projects, administered justice according to the king's law, and, most importantly, he collected the taxes in the form of grain and goods and sent the royal portion upriver to the capital. He was a middle manager in a divine corporation, and his loyalty was, in theory, absolute. These nomes were the 42 traditional provinces of Egypt, each with its own distinct identity and local deities. The nomarch's power was considerable, but it was always derived directly from the king. He was a steward, not a lord. He held his position at the pharaoh's pleasure. If he failed in his duties or showed a hint of disloyalty, he could be replaced. This system ensured that power remained where it was supposed to be, in the hands of the living God in the capital. It was a crucial part of the machinery of centralized control. But even before the Great Collapse, cracks were appearing in this system. Over the generations of the late Old Kingdom, the position of nomarch began to change subtly. Instead of being a rotating appointment, it increasingly became a hereditary office, passed down from father to son. This meant that immense wealth and influence began to accumulate in the hands of a few powerful families in the provinces. They started to see their nome not just as a temporary assignment, but as their personal, family-owned property. The seeds of independence were being sown long before the drought began. These provincial dynasties grew rich from the productivity of their lands. They built lavish estates and supported their own local priesthoods and cults. While they still paid lip service to the king, their true power base was local. They commanded the loyalty of the people in their district, people who saw the nomarch every day, while the pharaoh was a distant, almost mythical figure. The nomarch was the man who settled their disputes and managed the canals they depended on. His authority was immediate and tangible. The pharaoh's was becoming more and more abstract. Then the drought and famine hit, and this abstract authority evaporated completely. The central government could no longer offer anything to the provinces, no food from the royal granaries, no soldiers for protection, no guidance, no hope. The pharaoh's divine mandate was a joke. The nomarchs were now faced with a stark choice: let their people starve and their province descend into chaos while waiting for orders that would never come, or take matters into their own hands. It was the most important decision of their lives, and almost all of them made the same choice. They became warlords. It was a natural evolution. The first priority was to secure what little food was left. This meant using armed retainers to guard the local granaries against both starving peasants and raiding parties from neighboring nomes. These small bands of private guards quickly grew into full-fledged private armies. The nomarch was no longer just an administrator. He was a general, the sole protector of his people. His authority was now backed not by the distant pharaoh, but by the spears of the soldiers who ate at his table. With a private army comes the need for a private treasury. Since the flow of taxes to the capital had stopped, the nomarchs kept all the revenue for themselves. This created a vicious cycle for the central government. The less power it had, the less revenue it received, which meant it had even less power to project its authority, which meant it received even less revenue. The pharaonic state was in a death spiral, while the provincial lords grew stronger with every passing harvest, no matter how meager. The most vivid evidence of this new reality comes from the nomarchs themselves. Their tomb inscriptions from this period are monuments to self-aggrandizement. They are elaborate, shameless works of propaganda designed to justify their seizure of power. They portray themselves as heroic saviors, benevolent fathers to their people, single-handedly holding back the tide of chaos. They were crafting a new narrative of power, one in which they, not the pharaoh, were the central characters. The tomb of Catastrophe is the most blatant example. He calls himself the champion of his nome and boasts, "I am the hero without equal." He details how he led his army south to fight the neighboring nome of Thebes, a clear act of unsanctioned civil war. He talks about feeding his people and protecting his borders. He is, in his own words, a king in all but name. The actual king in Memphis is an afterthought, a ghost from a system that no longer mattered. This wasn't just happening in one province. All up and down the Nile, local lords were fortifying their towns, raising armies, and fighting their neighbors. Egypt had degenerated into a patchwork of petty kingdoms, a chaotic chessboard of shifting alliances and brutal little wars. The unity of the two lands, the great achievement of the first pharaohs, was a distant memory. The country was cannibalizing itself, with each nome fighting for its own survival at the expense of its neighbors. For the average Egyptian, this was a terrifying new reality. Their world, once a single, unified, predictable nation under a god-king, was now a dangerous and uncertain landscape. Traveling between nomes could be deadly. A farmer's fields could become a battlefield overnight. Loyalty to the pharaoh was meaningless. Your only hope for protection was the local strongman, whose rule could be as brutal as it was protective. You paid your taxes to him and you fought in his army, because the alternative was starvation or death at the hands of a rival lord. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, was a time of intense political chaos. The title of Pharaoh still existed, but it held little real power outside the immediate vicinity of the old capital. In fact, multiple dynasties of kings claimed to be ruling simultaneously from different cities, none of them able to impose their will on the entire country. The land was fractured, and the Nomarks were the new kings, each ruling their own slice of the shattered kingdom. They began to mimic the trappings of royalty to legitimize their rule. They adopted royal-sounding titles, established their own formal courts, and, as we've seen, built tombs that rivaled those of the old kings in their ambition, if not their scale. They were creating a new, localized model of power, based not on a divine national mandate, but on practical, military control of a specific territory. They were the new reality. The great irony is that the Nomarks, in their quest for self-preservation, were both the symptom and the cause of the disunity. Their rise was a direct result of the central government's collapse, but their independent actions, the hoarding of food, the private armies, the local wars, ensured that the country would remain fractured and chaotic for generations. They were the children of chaos, and they perpetuated it. Their inscriptions reveal a worldview that is profoundly different from that of the Old Kingdom. The focus is no longer on the grand cosmic order maintained by the king, it is on the practical, the immediate, the local. "I gave bread to the hungry and clothes to the naked," one Nomark boasts. "I was a father to the orphan and a husband to the widow." These are the claims of a good local leader, not a god who controls the universe. The scale of ambition had shrunk from the cosmic to the parochial. This shift represents the final death of the Old Kingdom ideology. The grand unified vision was gone. In its place was a fierce, competitive localism. The identity of being Egyptian was temporarily overshadowed by the identity of being from a specific nome, loyal to a specific lord. The country had, in effect, reverted to the state it had been in before the legendary King Narmer first unified it almost 1,000 years earlier. The rise of the Nomarks was a brutal but necessary adaptation to a world where the old rules no longer applied. They were the survivors, the ones who were pragmatic enough to see that the system was broken and strong enough to build something new in its place. Their methods were often violent and their motives selfish, but they were the ones who held pockets of Egyptian society together while the state itself dissolved. Ultimately, it would be one of these powerful nomarchal families, the rulers of the southern city of Thebes, who would, after generations of conflict, finally conquer their rivals and reunite the land of Egypt, kicking off the new golden age of the Middle Kingdom. But that is another story. The legacy of this era was the permanent decentralization of some power away from the king. The local lords had tasted true independence, and they would never again be the simple, obedient servants they had been in the age of the pyramids. The forgotten apocalypse of the Old Kingdom was therefore not just a story of drought and famine, but a story of political implosion. It was the story of how a nation built on the idea of a single divine will shattered into 100 competing ambitions. The Nomarks, the local lords, were the inheritors of this broken world, the kings of the chaos, each ruling their own small piece of the wreckage. With the pharaoh's authority in tatters and the country carved up by opportunistic local lords, Egypt entered the final and perhaps most brutal phase of its collapse. The fragile piece of the Old Kingdom, an era so stable it was almost boring, was over. What followed was not a quiet decay, but a loud, violent, and messy disintegration. The Nomarks, having declared their independence, now looked at their neighbors' territory with greedy eyes. The competition for scarce resources, food, water, and land, was about to turn deadly. The nation was about to go to war with itself. This was the era of fragmentation, a time when the very concept of a unified Egypt seemed like a distant myth. The lofty ideal of the two lands united under a single god-king was replaced by a grim new reality, the 42 nomes, each for itself. The bonds of national identity, forged over centuries, snapped under the pressure of famine and fear. What was left was a chaotic free-for-all, a nationwide brawl where loyalty extended only as far as the local warlords' reach. Unified Egypt, more like every man for himself Egypt. The peace that had allowed for the building of the pyramids was a forgotten luxury. Now, the main construction projects were no longer grand tombs, but crude defensive walls around towns. The primary state activity was no longer monumental building, but petty warfare. The sound of the quarry was replaced by the clash of spears and the cries of the wounded. This wasn't a war against a foreign enemy. It was a war of neighbor against neighbor, a bitter and personal conflict that tore the country apart from the inside out. Of the initial chaos, two major power blocks began to emerge, forming the main factions in this sprawling civil war. In the north, a new line of kings established themselves in the city of Heracleopolis. These rulers, forming the 9th and 10th dynasties, were recognized as pharaohs, but their actual control was limited to parts of Middle and Lower Egypt. They were trying to glue the northern half of the kingdom back together, claiming the traditional authority of the pharaonic crown. But in the south, a rival power was stirring. The Nomarks of the city of Thebes, a previously unremarkable provincial town, were growing ambitious. These Theban lords, a tough and determined family line that included several men named Intef and Mentuhotep, refused to recognize the authority of the Heracleopolitan kings. They saw themselves as the true heirs to Egyptian glory, and began a long, brutal campaign to conquer the entire country. The stage was set for a bitter, century-long struggle, the North versus the South. This wasn't a war of grand, decisive battles, at least not at first. It was a slow, grinding conflict, a war of attrition fought up and down the Nile. Think of it less like a world war and more like a vicious, large-scale turf war. The border between the northern and southern spheres of influence was a fluid, violent frontier, shifting back and forth with each raid and skirmish. The primary goals were simple: seize a rival town, gain control of a stretch of the river, or capture a critical irrigation canal. The armies involved were a far cry from the unified national force of the Old Kingdom. These were private armies, loyal only to the specific nomarch or king who paid and fed them. They were likely a mix of professional soldiers, local militias, and even foreign mercenaries, particularly Nubian archers from the south, who were famed for their skill. It was a brutal, personal kind of fighting, often between men who might have considered themselves countrymen a generation earlier. The inscriptions of the time paint a picture of constant, low-level warfare. A nomarch would boast in his tomb of how he rescued his town from an attack, or how he extended his borders by conquering a nearby village. These weren't grand campaigns of imperial conquest. They were desperate, bloody squabbles over scraps of land and dwindling resources. The violence was endemic, a constant feature of life that disrupted trade, travel, and any hope of a return to normalcy. The warlord Unktivi, our go-to example of a first intermediate period strongman, gives us a perfect snapshot of this reality. He proudly details his wars against the rising power of Thebes to his south. He describes loading his army onto boats and sailing to attack the neighboring province, asserting that his forces brought panic to the Theban nome. He frames these actions as heroic defenses of his people, but in reality, they were acts of aggression in a widening civil war, fueled by personal ambition. He also reveals the grim connection between war and food. He boasts that he was able to acquire grain for his people from the south even while fighting them. This suggests that these conflicts were complex affairs, a mix of outright fighting, armed trading expeditions, and brutal resource grabs. It was a messy, pragmatic struggle for survival, where today's enemy might be tomorrow's reluctant trading partner, all depending on who had the last remaining sack of barley. For the common people of Egypt, this was an unmitigated disaster. Their lives were already stalked by famine. Now they were also haunted by war. A farmer's field could be trampled by marching soldiers, his meager harvest seized to feed an army. Young men were conscripted to fight and die in a war for a local lord's ambition. To be on the losing side of a skirmish meant your village could be sacked, your possessions stolen, and your family left with nothing. The breakdown of central authority meant a complete collapse of law and order. The famous story of the Tale of the Eloquent Peasants dates from around this time. It tells of a man whose goods are unjustly seized by a corrupt official. The peasants' long and eloquent series of appeals for justice eventually reaches the king, but the story's setting reflects the reality of the era, a land where travel was dangerous, and a common man could be easily robbed by the powerful with little hope for recourse. Justice had become a luxury few could afford. The very identity of being Egyptian began to fracture. For centuries, a person's primary identity was as a subject of the divine Pharaoh, a citizen of the unified two lands. Now, your identity was intensely local. You were a man of Thebes, or Heracleopolis, or Asyut. Your neighbor from the next nome was not your countryman. He was a potential enemy, a rival for the water in your canal. The national consciousness dissolved into a paranoid and hostile localism. This constant state of war left physical scars on the land. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of massive, crude mud-brick fortifications built around towns during this period. Places that had never needed walls for 1,000 years were suddenly turned into fortresses. These walls are the silent, earthen witnesses to the fear and violence of the era. They speak of a society that was no longer at peace with itself, a people who had to barricade themselves against their own neighbors. The human cost is even more starkly illustrated by one of the most poignant discoveries from this time, the tomb of the soldiers at Deir el-Bahari, near Thebes. In a simple, undecorated tomb, archaeologists found the linen-wrapped bodies of about 60 men. These were not nobles or priests, they were soldiers. Their bodies bore the unmistakable signs of violent death in battle. Skulls were crushed, ribs were pierced by arrows, and limbs bore terrible wounds. They were casualties of the war for the reunification of Egypt. These fallen soldiers, buried together in a mass grave, provide a grim counterpoint to the glorious boasts of the warlords. The Nomarks wrote of glory and victory in their tombs, but the bodies of these men tell the real story of the civil war, a story of pain, suffering, and violent death. They were the human price of the Pharaoh's failure and the Nomarks' ambition. They died for the dream of a new, unified Egypt. The civil war dragged on for more than a century. Generations were born and died, knowing nothing but conflict and uncertainty. The struggle between the northern kings of Heracleopolis and the southern lords of Thebes became the central drama of the age. It was a fight for the soul of Egypt, a battle to decide who would inherit the shattered remnants of the old kingdom and forge a new future. Eventually, the tide began to turn in favor of the south. The Theban nomarchs were relentless, disciplined, and ambitious. Under a series of powerful rulers, culminating in the great Mentuhotep II, the Theban armies pushed steadily north, conquering their rivals one by one. The fighting was fierce, and the inscriptions speak of great turmoil, but the Thebans were driven by a powerful vision, the reunification of the two lands under their rule. The final victory of Mentuhotep II around the year 2040 BCE brought the long dark night of the first intermediate period to a close. He defeated the last of the Heracleopolitan kings, crushed the remaining independent nomarchs, and once again declared himself the ruler of a single unified Egypt. This event marks the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity, the Middle Kingdom. But the scars of the fragmentation and civil war remained. The experience of chaos, famine, and war had profoundly changed the Egyptian psyche. They had seen their world collapse, their gods fall silent, and their countrymen turn against each other. The supreme, almost naive confidence of the Old Kingdom was gone forever, replaced by a more sober, cautious, and perhaps more realistic view of the world. The Civil War was the final bloody act in the tragedy of the Old Kingdom's collapse. It was the inevitable result of a system that placed all its faith in a single point of failure. When that point failed, the entire structure imploded. The war was a painful, but perhaps necessary fire that purged the old, broken system and cleared the way for a new, more resilient Egypt to be built from the ashes. It was the dark, violent dawn of a new age. For centuries, the defining image of Egyptian civilization was one of tireless, monumental construction, the sound of hammers on stone, the sight of thousands of workers hauling massive blocks, the slow, inexorable rise of a new pyramid against the sky. This was the heartbeat of the Old Kingdom. It was the ultimate expression of their power, their faith, and their national unity. But as the kingdom collapsed into chaos, that heartbeat faded, and then fell silent. The age of the Great Pyramids was over. The silence from the great quarries and construction ramps at Giza, Saqqara, and Dashur must have been deafening. It was a tangible symbol of the nation's failure. The grandest, most ambitious building program in human history had ground to a halt, not by choice, but by the grim reality of the circumstances. The society that had built stairways to the stars for their dead kings could no longer even guarantee a daily meal for the living. The cosmic ambition had crashed headfirst into worldly desperation. Building a tomb for your immortal soul, you can't even build a sandwich, mate. This cessation of grand projects wasn't a single decision made by a king. It was an inevitable consequence of the complete unraveling of the state. It was a systemic failure. The complex, intricate machine that was the pyramid-building enterprise required a very specific set of fuel sources: surplus food, surplus labor, national unity, and absolute central authority. And Egypt was fresh out of all of them. The Pyramid Age didn't end. It starved to death and then got broken up in a civil war. Let's first appreciate the sheer mind-boggling complexity of what they had been doing. Building a pyramid was the ancient equivalent of a moon mission. It required a level of logistical genius that was unparalleled in the ancient world. It was a project that could only be undertaken by a peaceful, prosperous, and politically unified state, ruled by a king whose authority was absolute. It was the ultimate luxury item, affordable only during the best of times, and these were, implanically, the worst of times. The first and most critical component of the machine was food. Vast quantities of surplus grain were needed to bake the bread and brew the beer to feed the tens of thousands of workers. These workers were not slaves, but conscripted Egyptian farmers who labored on the projects during the Akhet, the season of the Nile flood when their fields were underwater. The state granaries were their cafeterias. When the famine hit and the granaries emptied, the entire system became impossible. You cannot ask a man to haul limestone blocks on an empty stomach. The second component was manpower. The national construction projects depended on a massive mobile labor force that could be conscripted from all over the country and sent to the royal cemeteries near the capital. But with the country fractured by civil war, this was no longer possible. The Pharaoh had no authority to conscript workers from a province ruled by a rival nomarch. And those young men weren't idle anyway. They were busy serving in the Nomarks' private armies, fighting against their neighbors. The workforce was now armed and fighting itself. The third component was the supply chain. A pyramid required a dizzying array of materials from every corner of the kingdom and beyond. Fine white limestone for the casing came from Tura, across the river from the capital. Hard granite for the burial chambers was quarried in Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. Copper for the tools had to be mined in the distant Sinai Peninsula. All of this required safe, state-controlled travel and transport up and down the Nile. In an era of civil war and banditry, the river was no longer a secure highway, it was a dangerous frontier. A nomarch in the south, who controlled the Aswan quarries, was not about to send his precious granite north to a king he didn't recognize, especially when he needed it for his own local projects. The national supply chain disintegrated into a collection of privately owned, fiercely guarded local resources. The grand, unified economic engine that powered the Pyramid Age had been dismantled and sold for parts. The machine was well and truly broken. So what happened to the kings and nobles who died during this chaotic period? Where were their grand houses of eternity? The answer is a story of dramatically downsized ambitions. The last pyramid of the Old Kingdom, that of Pepi II, was already a shadow of its former Giza glory, smaller and built with a core of rubble that was then cased in stone. After him, the royal pyramid tradition effectively died for generations. The kings of the first intermediate period, if they could afford a tomb at all, were buried in much smaller, simpler structures, many of which are now lost to time. The change is most visible in the tombs of the nomarchs themselves. These new provincial lords were the only ones with any real wealth, but even their resources were a pittance compared to the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. They built their tombs not in the royal cemeteries near the capital, but in their own local provinces, at sites like Beni Hassan, Mea, and Deir el-Gabrawi. These tombs were cut into rock cliffs, not built as freestanding structures. They were impressive by local standards, but they were a world away from the divine mountains of stone at Giza. The art inside these provincial tombs tells the same story of fragmentation. The strict, refined, and uniform artistic style of the royal court disappeared. In its place, a variety of quirky, energetic, and sometimes downright clumsy local styles emerged. The proportions of figures might be slightly off, the hieroglyphs less perfectly carved. This wasn't because they were bad artists, but because they were isolated artists, cut off from the master workshops and established traditions of the capital. It was the artistic equivalent of a regional dialect emerging after a common language has been lost. This new art is incredibly valuable to historians, as it gives us a rare glimpse into the daily life and concerns of the provinces. While Old Kingdom art focused on the eternal divine relationship between the king and the gods, the art of the Nomarks' tombs is often more personal. It depicts local events, boasts of the Lord's achievements in feeding his people, and illustrates the soldiers of his private army. It is the art of a new, more pragmatic, and more dangerous world. Perhaps the most telling sign of the times was the new attitude towards the old monuments. The great pyramids and temples of the Old Kingdom, once held as sacred ancestral spaces, were now seen in a much more practical light. They were, after all, massive, conveniently located mountains of pre-cut, high-quality stone. And in an age of scarcity, nothing goes to waste. The process of dismantling older monuments for building materials began in earnest. This was the ultimate act of desecration, a sign of the complete loss of respect for the old ways and the legendary kings who had built them. A local lord in need of stone for his own small building project wouldn't hesitate to pry the fine white limestone casing off a nearby pyramid. Why go to the trouble of quarrying new stone when the ancestors had left such a well-stocked lumber yard? The houses of eternity were being recycled to build the fortifications of a chaotic present. This practice also reveals the loss of the central ideology. The belief that the preservation of the king's tomb was essential for the well-being of the entire cosmos was gone. In a world of every man for himself, the dead king's eternal life was a low priority compared to the immediate need for a defensive wall or a new temple for a local god. The sacred had become mundane. The silence of the Quarries also represented a profound crisis of identity for the Egyptians. For 5 centuries they were the pyramid builders. It was who they were. It was the national project, the collective enterprise that united the people and expressed their devotion to their king and their gods. To no longer be able to do it was a confession of failure. It was an admission that they were no longer the great, unified and divinely favored people they had once been. Imagine a society of engineers and architects who had forgotten how to build. Imagine a people who lived in the shadow of monuments so vast and glorious that they could no longer even comprehend how their own ancestors had created them. The skills, the organization, and the sheer national will required for such projects had been lost. The pyramids now stood as silent, reproachful reminders of a lost golden age, a golden age that had ended in famine, war, and ruin. The end of the grand projects was, in essence, the end of the Old Kingdom's grand idea. The idea that you could, through sheer force of will and collective labor, build a perfect, eternal order on earth. That idea had been tested by reality, and it had been found wanting. The new era would be defined by smaller, more human-sized ambitions, survival, security, and the slow, painful process of putting their shattered world back together. It would take generations for Egypt to recover to a point where kings could once again dream of monumental building. When they did in the Middle and New Kingdoms, their projects would be different. While some, later kings, did build pyramids, they were never on the same scale as those of the Old Kingdom, and the focus of royal construction shifted more towards grand temples for the national gods, like the great temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. The age of the pyramid as the sole focus of the state was gone for good. The forgotten apocalypse had taught the Egyptians a hard lesson in humility. They learned that human ambition, even when divinely inspired, has its limits. They learned that order is fragile and chaos is never far away. And they learned that even the most impressive monuments are no match for a failing river and an empty stomach. The silence of the pyramids is a testament to that grim education. The great construction sites fell dormant, the villages of the workers were abandoned, and the desert sands began to creep back over the once bustling roads and ramps. The hum of industry was replaced by the whisper of the wind. It was the end of a chapter in human history, a time when mankind had reached for the heavens and had, for a brief, glorious moment, touched them, only to fall back to a much harder, more chaotic earth. The pyramids were for no one now. They were just mountains of stone, lonely sentinels guarding the memory of a world that had vanished forever. In the great, chaotic unraveling of the old kingdom, it turned out that no one was safe. Not the living, who were stalked by famine and war, and certainly not the dead. For generations the Egyptians had poured their wealth, their labor, and their deepest beliefs into preparing for the afterlife. The tomb was a sacred, inviolable space, a house of eternity. But as the kingdom collapsed, the line between the sacred and the profane was erased by desperation. The nation's necropolises, the silent cities of the dead, were about to get some very loud, very unwelcome visitors. The breakdown of law and order had a grim and inevitable side effect, a nationwide epidemic of tomb robbing. This wasn't just petty theft, it was a profound spiritual crisis, a violation of the most fundamental tenets of their civilization. The Egyptians believed the afterlife was a real physical continuation of this life, and they packed accordingly. Their tombs were eternal starter homes, fully furnished and stocked for 1,000,000 years of bliss. But it turned out that eternity's warranty had some serious limitations. Even in death you couldn't get any peace. Very rude. This wasn't the quiet, opportunistic tomb robbing that had probably always existed on the fringes of society. This was a wholesale, systematic plundering. It was the desperate, logical conclusion of a society that had run out of everything. When there is no food in the fields and no gold in the treasury, where do you look? You look to the only places where wealth still existed, the beautifully appointed, heavily stocked, and suddenly very vulnerable homes of the long dead. The ancestors had inadvertently created the country's last remaining savings accounts, and the living were coming to make a withdrawal. To understand the horror of this, we have to remember what the tomb meant to an ancient Egyptian. It wasn't just a place of burial, it was a magical launch pad to the next world. Every single element was crucial for a successful journey. The physical body had to be preserved through mummification, as it was the anchor for the soul. The tomb itself was the house of eternity, a safe haven, and the grave goods, the food, furniture, tools, and jewelry, were the necessary supplies the deceased would need to live comfortably in the field of reeds, their version of paradise. The walls of the tomb were covered in magical spells and depictions of an idealized life, meant to magically provide for the deceased forever. Offerings of real food and drink were brought regularly to the tomb chapel by priests or family members. The entire system was a complex, beautiful, and deeply serious effort to cheat death and ensure life everlasting. It was the central project of their culture, and it was all about to be kicked over by a bunch of hungry, desperate people with crowbars. The great royal necropolises at Saqqara and Giza, home to the pyramid-building kings and their vast courts, were the epicenters of this desecration. For centuries these had been sacred landscapes, protected by royal guards and a powerful priesthood, all funded by the state. Their sanctity was a cornerstone of the nation's religious life. But in the chaos of the first intermediate period, that protection vanished. The state that was supposed to guard the dead kings could no longer even protect the living ones. The necropolis police had been laid off. With the guards gone and the priests either fled or starving, the cities of the dead were left open and vulnerable. They became dark, lawless places, a grim mirror of the chaos in the land of the living. And so the robbing began. It was likely done by organized gangs, perhaps even composed of the very stonemasons who knew the secret layouts of the tombs, or the priests who knew exactly which ones contained the most valuable offerings. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a targeted, desperate mining of the past. What were they looking for? Anything and everything of value. The most obvious prizes were the precious metals. Gold, which they believed to be the flesh of the gods, was used extensively in royal and noble burials, in jewelry, amulets, death masks, and inlaid furniture. Silver, which was actually rarer than gold in ancient Egypt, was also highly prized. In a world without currency, a single gold bracelet could buy a family food for months. The temptation was simply too great to resist. But it wasn't just about the bling. The robbers took everything. Finely crafted wooden furniture, a luxury in a country with few trees, chests of high-quality linen, jars of imported wine, oil and honey, even the preserved food offerings, mummified ducks, loaves of bread, dried cuts of meat, that had been left for the deceased would have been a feast for a starving family. The houses of eternity were being stripped bare, their contents dragged back into the desperate world of the living. The true horror, however, lay in the treatment of the dead themselves. The goal of the robbers was to get in and out as quickly as possible, with no regard for the sanctity of the deceased. Sealed doors were smashed open, stone sarcophagi were chiseled apart, and the burial chambers were ransacked with brutal efficiency. The Admonitions of Ippur paints a vivid, poetic picture of this chaos. Behold, the possessors of tombs are ejected onto the high ground. He who made a pyramid is now empty. The once powerful dead were now homeless. The most shocking act was the desecration of the mummy itself. To an Egyptian, the preservation of the physical body was paramount. The soul, or Ba, needed to be able to recognize its body to return to it each night. The robbers, in their frantic search for valuables, would rip the linen wrappings off the mummy to find the magical amulets and jewelry that were always tucked within the bandages. They would pry the gold mask off the face and break the fingers to get at the rings. After stripping the mummy of its valuables, the body itself, the sacred vessel of eternal life, was often treated with utter contempt. It might be broken apart, cast aside in a corner of the tomb, or even burned for fuel. To an ancient Egyptian, this was the ultimate crime, a form of spiritual murder. To burn a body was to condemn that person to complete and total annihilation, to erase them from existence forever. It was the most terrifying fate imaginable. We can see the evidence of this brutality in the archaeological record. Egyptologists frequently find tombs that were plundered in antiquity. They find the smashed remains of sarcophagi, the scattered fragments of grave goods deemed worthless by the robbers, and, most poignantly, the disordered, unwrapped, and often broken bones of the tomb's owner, swept into a pile. These are the ancient crime scenes that bear silent witness to the desperation of the first intermediate period. The psychological impact of this widespread desecration on the living must have been devastating. It was a daily, visible confirmation that the world was broken. The tombs of their parents, their grandparents, the great kings they revered, all were being violated. It was a profound betrayal of the pact between the generations, the sacred duty of the living to care for the dead. The chaos of the present was actively destroying the past, and in doing so, it was also destroying any hope for the future. If even the great Khufu, builder of the mightiest pyramid on earth, could not protect his eternal rest from violation, what hope could a common person have? The entire belief system, which promised a path to eternity for those who lived a just life and prepared properly for death, was shown to be a lie. Or at least a promise with no effective security system. The afterlife, it seemed, was not a gated community. The gates had been smashed open, and the celestial neighborhood was in ruins. This crisis of faith led to significant changes in funerary practices. In the Middle Kingdom, which rose from the ashes of this collapse, we see new strategies to try and outsmart the tomb robbers. Tombs were hidden in more complex and inaccessible ways. Sarcophagi were made from single, massive blocks of the hardest stone, like quartzite, making them incredibly difficult to break into. The Egyptians were engaged in a centuries-long arms race against the tomb robbers, a race that the robbers almost always won in the end. The plundering of the tombs was more than just a crime wave. It was a revolution against the old order. It was a violent rejection of a system that had lavished unimaginable wealth on the dead while the living starved. You can almost hear the bitter justification of the robbers Why should this dead lord have 1,000 loaves of bread in his tomb, while my living children have none? It was a desperate, brutal, and tragic redistribution of wealth, from the silent dead to the screaming, hungry living. The beautiful, serene vision of the Egyptian afterlife, a peaceful paradise where one could hunt and fish and feast for all time, was shattered. The new, unspoken reality was that the afterlife was a place that could be broken into, a home that could be ransacked, a body that could be torn apart. It was just as unsafe and chaotic as the world of the living. There was no escape from the suffering, not even in death. This era of desecration marks the definitive end of the Old Kingdom's worldview. Theirs was a world built on order, confidence, and a deep-seated belief in the permanence of their creations and the security of their eternity. The first intermediate period revealed this to be a beautiful illusion. The tombs, meant to be eternal, were temporary. The bodies, meant to be inviolable, were fragile. The rude awakening for the Egyptian dead was a symptom of the sickness that had infected the entire land. A society that can no longer protect its dead has lost its connection to its past and its faith in its future. It has lost its soul. The empty, plundered tombs of the Old Kingdom are perhaps the most haunting monuments to this forgotten apocalypse. They are memorials not just to the dead who were buried there, but to the death of an entire civilization's most cherished belief. An apocalypse isn't just something you can measure in skeletons or shattered pottery. It's also measured in the death of hope, in the loss of a shared story, and in the art that a traumatized culture creates to make sense of its own ruin. The Egyptians of the Old Kingdom, masters of confident, serene art, were now faced with a world that was anything but. So they did what any civilization in the midst of a nervous breakdown would do. They invented emo poetry. They began to write. We are incredibly fortunate that some of these texts survived, because they give us a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the psyche of a collapsing world. This new genre of literature, often called the Lamentations or pessimistic literature, is a world away from the triumphant inscriptions of the pyramid builders. It is a literature of despair, of chaos, and of bitter complaint. It's the sound of a people looking at their broken world and asking, "What in the name of Ra happened to us?" Ancient Egyptians writing depressing poetry about the good old days. It's different when you're starving. These texts are the emotional memory of the collapse. They are the ancient equivalent of a crisis hotline, a national diary entry detailing every single thing that had gone wrong. They confirmed that the drought, the famine, the civil war, and the breakdown of order weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a profound, society-wide trauma that shook the Egyptian people to their core. For the first time, they were putting their misery into words, creating a powerful and haunting testament to their suffering. The undisputed masterpiece of this gloomy genre is a work known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer. The text, preserved on a papyrus now in the Leiden Museum, is a long, fiery, and deeply cynical speech delivered by a sage named Ipuwer to a silent and utterly useless king. It's less of a polite admonition and more of a blistering, feature-length complaint. Ipuwer essentially grabs the pharaoh by the shoulders and spends the entire poem pointing out every single way the country has fallen into ruin, effectively giving him the worst performance review in history. The scene itself is a powerful symbol of the era. The pharaoh, the divine linchpin of the cosmos, sits mute while a subject lectures him on his failures. The living god has no answers. Ipuwer, on the other hand, has a very, very long list of problems. He walks the king through a hellscape that was once the proud land of Egypt, detailing the chaos with the precision of a traumatized accountant. His speech is a literary tour of the apocalypse, a doom scroll from the ancient world. One of Ipuwer's central themes is the complete inversion of society, the total collapse of Ma'at's ordained social order. He cries out, "Behold, the poor of the land have become rich, and the possessor of property is now one who has nothing." This wasn't a celebration of social mobility, it was a lament for a world turned upside down. It was the chaos of the old, established families losing everything while violent opportunists seized wealth and power. He paints a series of bitter, ironic vignettes of this new reality. "Behold, she who had not even a box now has a chest," he says of a poor woman rising in status. But the flip side is tragic. Behold, ladies of rank are now on the work gangs, nobles are in distress, while the poor man is full of joy. And, most famously, gold and lapis lazuli, silver and turquoise, are hung about the necks of slave girls. But noblewomen walk through the land, and mistresses of houses say, "Would that we had something to eat." Ipua's Egypt is also a land consumed by violence and fear, a direct reflection of the civil wars and the breakdown of local security. "Men go to plough with their shields," he reports, a grim image of farmers who have to be prepared for a fight just to tend their fields. He speaks of a land where the river is blood, a phrase so powerful it could mean the literal bloodshed of civil war, or perhaps the red, muddy but uselessly low floodwaters. In either case, it is an image of profound sickness. The lawlessness is absolute. A man regards his son as his enemy. Ipuwer laments, suggesting the complete breakdown of even family bonds. The laws of the judgment hall are cast forth. Men walk on them in public places. The very concept of justice has been thrown into the street like garbage. His words paint a picture of a nation that has lost its moral compass, a place where might makes right and the only law is survival. Beyond the political and social chaos, Ipuwer gives voice to a deep, personal and national despair. "Laughter has perished and is no longer made," he says. "It is groaning that is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations. The sound of joy had been replaced by the sound of grief." This was a nation in mourning for itself, for the peace and security it had lost. It was a collective depression, written down in poetry. This existential dread is explored even more directly in another text from this era, the dispute between a man and his ba, or his soul. In it, a man, weary of the misery of life, contemplates suicide. His own soul argues with him, trying to convince him to live. The man describes the world as a place of such profound injustice and sorrow that death seems like a welcome release. It is a deeply philosophical and incredibly bleak work, a conversation a person has with themselves when they have lost all hope. The man in the dispute laments the breakdown of trust and community. "To whom do I speak today?" he asks. "Brothers are evil, and the friends of today, they are not lovable." He describes a world full of greed, corruption, and unkindness. It is the intimate, personal perspective on the same societal collapse that Ipuwer described on a grand scale. It's the voice of an individual trying to navigate the psychological wreckage of a failed state. These texts are our window into the soul of the First Intermediate Period. They show us that the Egyptians were not just passive victims of climate change and political failure. They were thinking, feeling people who were grappling with the collapse of their reality. They were trying to understand why it had happened. In the admonitions, Ipuwer repeatedly blames the silent, inactive king. "Authority, perception, and justice are with you," he cries, "but it is confusion that you would set throughout the land." He sees the chaos not as an accident, but as a failure of leadership. He yearns for a strong, active ruler, a shepherd who can quell the violence and restore order. "Where is he today?" Ipuwer asks. "Does he sleep, perchance? Behold, his might is not seen." In a way, these lamentations are a form of political protest, a cry for a savior king to arise and put the broken world back together. They are a plea for the return of Ma'at. Now, some scholars argue that these texts might not be literal, journalistic accounts of the First Intermediate Period. They suggest the chaos described might be a literary troupe, a stylized exaggeration used to praise the king who commissioned the text by contrasting his peaceful reign with the fictional horrors of the past. It's a way of saying, look how good things are now compared to the terrible before time. But even if they are not literal history, they are something just as important. They are emotional history. They reveal what the Egyptians feared. They reveal what they considered to be the ultimate nightmare, a world without the king, a world without order, a world where the sacred rules were broken. The trauma of the First Intermediate Period was so profound that it became the definitive image of hell on earth for their culture. They wrote these poems because the memory of the real chaos was so strong. These lamentations mark a major turning point in Egyptian literature and thought. The confident, optimistic, and straightforward worldview of the old kingdom was gone. It was replaced by a new maturity, a new introspection, and a new capacity for expressing doubt and despair. They had learned that the world was a complex and often cruel place, that order was not guaranteed, and that life was full of suffering. It was a grim education, but it led to some of the most powerful and moving literature of the ancient world. The voice of Ipuwer, crying out in the wilderness of a collapsed state, is a voice that echoes through history. It is the voice of anyone who has lived through a dark time and yearned for a return to light and order. It is a testament to the human need to give voice to suffering, to complain, to lament, and in doing so, to begin the slow, painful process of making sense of it all. The apocalypse had given the Egyptians a new and much sadder story to tell. Just when it seemed that things could not possibly get any worse for the people of ancient Egypt, the universe decided to prove them wrong. They had endured drought, famine, the collapse of their government, civil war, and the desecration of their sacred traditions. They were starving, broken, and terrified. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that the final uninvited guests arrived at the apocalyptic party: pestilence and plague. These invisible enemies would add a new and horrifying dimension to the suffering, turning the land of the pharaohs into a giant petri dish. It was the perfect storm for a public health catastrophe. Famine, violence, and disease are a grim trio. They hold hands and dance together in the ruins of fallen civilizations. The malnutrition that racked the country was effectively a formal invitation for every pathogen in the Nile Valley to come and feast. And to make matters worse, the social chaos created the ideal conditions for these diseases to spread like wildfire. Just when you thought starving to death was bad, here comes the plague to spice things up a bit. The connection between starvation and sickness is a brutal and intimate one. Think of the human immune system as a well-trained army that protects the body from invasion. But that army, like any other, needs to be fed. A body deprived of essential nutrients, vitamins and calories, can no longer maintain its defenses. The immune system's soldiers become weak, sluggish, and ineffective. The walls of the fortress crumble, the watchtowers are left unmanned, and the gates are thrown wide open for any opportunistic microbe to march right in. For the Egyptians of the first intermediate period, their internal armies were in a state of complete collapse. Decades of hunger had left the population chronically malnourished. Their bodies, already weakened by the constant stress of survival, had no resources left to fight off infection. A simple sickness that a healthy person might have shaken off in a few days could now become a death sentence. The entire nation had a compromised immune system, making them exquisitely vulnerable to what was coming next. And what was coming was floating in the very water they drank. The Nile, once the pristine, life-giving artery of their civilization, had become a festering sewer. The annual flood that used to flush the system clean each year had failed. The river became low, stagnant, and choked with refuse. With the breakdown of any kind of organized sanitation, human and animal waste, along with the unburied bodies of the dead, contaminated the only water source available. It was a 5-star resort for bacteria and parasite. Every sip of water was a game of Russian roulette. Waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever would have run rampant through the population. These illnesses caused severe gastrointestinal distress, leading to dehydration, which is rapidly fatal in an already weakened and malnourished person. The once sacred Nile, the source of all life, was now actively poisoning the people who lived along its banks. It was a slow, agonizing betrayal. The living conditions were no better. As society broke down, people were displaced from their homes by violence or in a desperate search for food. They crowded together in squalid makeshift camps around the towns of the local warlords, the only places offering any semblance of security or the hope of a ration of grain. These crowded, unsanitary conditions were a paradise for diseases that spread through close contact, like tuberculosis, influenza, and various skin infections. There was no escape. The air they breathed and the water they drank were filled with pathogens. Their bodies were too weak to fight back, and the medical system they relied on, a complex blend of practical remedies and magical spells, was utterly overwhelmed. The Egyptian physician was a respected figure. But no amount of herbal poultices or incantations to the gods could stop a cholera epidemic in a starving population. The gods of healing, like all the others, appeared to be on an extended leave of absence. In Egyptian belief, disease was often seen as a supernatural attack, a punishment from angry gods, or a manifestation of the influence of malevolent spirits. They would have performed rituals, worn protective amulets, and prayed for divine intervention. But as the sickness spread and the death toll mounted, their faith in these methods must have withered. The magical defenses, like the physical ones, had failed. They were being attacked on all fronts, by enemies both seen and unseen. While we can't diagnose specific plagues with certainty from this distance, the bones of the victims tell a harrowing story. Paleopathologists who study diseases in ancient skeletal remains have found abundant evidence of the chronic sickness that afflicted this generation. The skulls of men, women, and children from this period are often pitted with a condition called porotic hyperostosis, particularly in the eye sockets. This is a telltale sign of severe chronic iron deficiency anemia. This anemia was a direct result of both poor diet and rampant parasitic infections like hookworm and schistosomiasis, which would have thrived in the contaminated water. These parasites would have latched onto the intestines of their hosts, constantly draining them of blood and nutrients. The Egyptians were literally being eaten from the inside out. Their bones record a story of a population that was not just starving, but also riddled with parasites, weak and profoundly anemic. Other skeletal markers paint an equally grim picture. Archaeologists often find Harris lines on the long bones of individuals from this era. These are thin lines that form when the growth of a bone is arrested for a period of time, due to severe malnutrition or illness, and then starts again. They are a permanent record of a traumatic event, a scar on the bone left by a period of intense physiological stress during childhood. The skeletons of this generation are full of these scars. Evidence for infectious diseases like tuberculosis has also been found. Tuberculosis can attack the spine, causing vertebrae to collapse and fuse together, leaving a distinctive, permanent signature. While not an epidemic on the scale of the Black Death, the presence of such chronic, debilitating diseases shows how the general poor health of the population allowed illnesses to take hold and fester in the community. It was a landscape of perpetual low-grade sickness, punctuated by deadly epidemic outbreaks. So now we have a complete picture of the misery. Imagine an average Egyptian family at this time. They are hungry, their ribs showing. The small plot of land they farmed is now dust. They have moved to a crowded, dirty camp outside the walls of a town ruled by a local warlord. The water they get from the river gives them constant stomach ailments. The father has been conscripted into the Lord's army, and the mother is trying to care for children who are listless and weak from anemia and recurring fevers. This wasn't a temporary crisis. It was the permanent state of existence. Of death, in this context, would have been a constant and familiar presence. Not the orderly, ritualized death that the Egyptians revered, but a messy, ugly, and unceremonious death. People would have died in their huts, in the streets, in the fields, and with the breakdown of burial customs, their bodies were often disposed of with little ceremony, dumped in mass graves or left in the river. This constant, visible presence of death would have added another layer of psychological trauma to the experience of the survivors. The Great Lamentations, like the admonitions of Ipuwer, speak to this reality, when Ipuwer says, "Groaning is throughout the land mingled with lamentations," he is not just speaking of the grief of war and famine, but surely also of the grief of sickness, the groaning of a people afflicted by constant debilitating disease, the wails of parents who have lost a child to a fever that a generation earlier they might have survived. It's important to remember that for the Egyptians, physical health and the health of the state were linked. The body of the king was tied to the body of the nation. A healthy king meant a healthy land. The rampant disease that swept through the population was yet another sign of the ultimate failure of the pharaoh. He could not maintain Ma'at, and as a result the bodies of his people were breaking down, just as the body politic had. The uninvited guests, the bacteria, the viruses, the parasites, had done their work. They had culled the weakened population, adding countless dead to the toll taken by starvation and violence. They were the microscopic foot soldiers of the apocalypse, the biological agents of chaos. They feasted on the ruins of the old kingdom, thriving in the conditions that its collapse had created. The generation that survived this crucible of famine, war, and plague was undoubtedly tougher, more resilient, and more cynical. They had stared into the abyss and had not blinked. They had endured the failure of their government, their gods, and even their own bodies. The experience would leave an indelible mark on their culture, leading to changes in their religion, their politics, and their understanding of the world. The sickness was the final insult, the last twist of the knife. It was nature's grim confirmation that the old order was dead and buried. The Egyptians had believed their land was a protected paradise, a bubble of divine order. The plagues of the first intermediate period were a brutal lesson that they were as vulnerable as any other people to the indifferent and often cruel mechanics of the natural world. Their house of eternity had been revealed to have a foundation of dust, and its halls were now filled with ghosts and disease. After the storm of famine, plague, and war had passed, Egypt did not simply wake up, dust itself off, and get back to the business of being a glorious, unified kingdom. The apocalypse was not a brief, dramatic event. It was a chronic condition. The recovery was a slow, painful, and messy process that would drag on for more than a century. This era, the first intermediate period, was a long, dark, and deeply awkward chapter in Egyptian history, a time when the nation had a prolonged identity crisis. Putting a shattered country back together is never a quick fix. There was no magic reset button to bring back the old kingdom. The old certainties were gone, the old power structures were dust, and the land was still fractured among competing warlords. It would take generations of struggle, diplomacy, and brutal warfare to slowly, painstakingly stitch the two lands back into a single entity. It took them about 140 years to finally figure out who was in charge. Faster than some modern bureaucracies, I suppose, but still a painfully long time to live in a failed state. For the people born during this period, a divided Egypt was the only reality they ever knew. The idea of a single, all-powerful pharaoh ruling from Memphis was a story their grandparents told them, a legend from a mythical golden age. Their world was one of local lords, shifting borders, and constant, low-level conflict. The national project was on hold, replaced by 100 different local projects, most of which involved building walls and sharpening spears. It was a century-long, nationwide political argument that frequently got physical. The dynastic history of this period is a perfect reflection of the chaos. Egyptologists have to deal with the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th dynasties, all overlapping and competing in this era. The 7th and 8th dynasties were short-lived, shadowy lines of kings in the old capital of Memphis who held little real power. They were ghosts on a throne, clinging to the memory of an authority that had long since evaporated. They were the political equivalent of a band playing on the deck of the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. The real power struggle coalesced around two major players. In the north, a new and more robust dynasty of kings, the 9th and 10th, set up their capital in the city of Heracleopolis. These Heracleopolitan kings saw themselves as the true successors to the Old Kingdom pharaohs. They controlled much of Lower and Middle Egypt and worked to restore the traditional culture and political structures. They were the establishment, the self-proclaimed legitimate government trying to put things back the way they were. From their perspective, they were the forces of order, trying to rein in the chaos and restore the proper rule of law. They likely viewed the ambitious lords of the south not as rivals, but as rebellious upstarts, provincial troublemakers who refused to accept their rightful authority. The Heracleopolitan kings were, in essence, the last gasp of the Old Kingdom's ideology, a determined but ultimately doomed attempt to turn back the clock and pretend the collapse had just been a temporary hiccup. But while the north looked to the past, the future of Egypt was being forged in the south, in a city that had previously been a provincial backwater, Thebes. The local Nomarks of Thebes had weathered the storm of the collapse, consolidated their power, and were now filled with a burning ambition. They established their own ruling dynasty, the 11th, and they had no intention of bending the knee to the kings in the north. They were the new money, the scrappy outsiders ready to challenge the old guard. The rise of Thebes was fueled by a potent combination of military discipline, political cunning, and a fierce sense of regional pride. The early Theban rulers, a succession of tough warlords named Intef, began the long process of consolidating the south. They fought and subdued their neighboring Nomarks, slowly building a powerful, unified southern state. They were creating a rival Egypt, a kingdom with its own identity and its own destiny, ready to challenge the north for control of the entire country. This set the stage for the Great Civil War, the protracted conflict between the House of Heracleopolis and the House of Thebes. This wasn't a single war, but a long, drawn-out struggle that defined the latter half of the First Intermediate Period. For decades, the two Egypts glared at each other across a contested and bloody border, usually around the ancient city of Abydos. It was a cold war that frequently turned hot, a painful stalemate that consumed the resources and lives of yet another generation. The Thebans were relentless. Under the leadership of the Intef kings, they slowly pushed the border northwards. The war was fought on the river and on the land, a series of sieges, raids, and battles for control of key towns and trade routes. It was a war to determine the very future of Egypt. Would it be ruled by the traditionalists in the north, or the dynamic, aggressive upstarts of the south? History, it turns out, favors the bold. The final act of this century-long drama came with the ascension of a Theban king, who would become one of the great figures of Egyptian history, Neb-Hepeter-Mentuhotep, or Mentuhotep II. He was a brilliant military strategist and a ruthless leader, the man who would finally finish the job his ancestors had started. He inherited a strong southern kingdom and a well-trained army, and he unleashed them upon the north with decisive force. After years of hard fighting, Mentuhotep's armies smashed the forces of the Heracleopolitan king and captured the northern capital. In approximately the year 2040 BCE, Mentuhotep II declared himself the ruler of a newly reunified Egypt. He took on the Horus name, "He who unites the two lands," a powerful and deeply symbolic statement. The long dark night of the First Intermediate Period was finally over. The national nervous breakdown had ended. But the Egypt that Mentuhotep now ruled was not the same country that had collapsed over a century earlier. The apocalypse had left deep and permanent scars. The experience of chaos, famine, and civil war had fundamentally changed the nation's politics, religion, and psyche. You can't just go through a century of trauma and expect everything to go back to normal. The Middle Kingdom, the new era of peace that Mentuhotep inaugurated, would be a very different beast from the Old Kingdom. One of the most significant changes was the shift in the political center of gravity. The old capital of Memphis, associated with the failure of the Old Kingdom kings, lost its prominence. The new capital, the home of the victorious dynasty, was Thebes. This southern city would become the religious and political heart of Egypt for much of the next 1,000 years. Its local god, a previously minor deity named Amun, was elevated to the king of the gods, eventually merging with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, the chief deity of the Egyptian empire. The power of the pharaoh himself had also been redefined. While the king was still considered divine, the remote, untouchable god-king of the Old Kingdom was replaced by a new model, the pharaoh as a good shepherd, a conscientious ruler responsible for the direct care and welfare of his people. The propaganda of the Middle Kingdom kings often emphasizes their role as protectors of the weak and providers of justice. This was a direct response to the memory of the chaos, a promise that the failures of the past would not be repeated. The Nomarks, the powerful provincial lords who had caused so much trouble, were not simply eliminated. The early Middle Kingdom pharaohs had to rule through them, carefully managing their ambitions and rewarding their loyalty. The state was more decentralized than it had been in the Old Kingdom, a tacit acknowledgement that absolute central power was both brittle and dangerous. The king now had to be a shrewd politician, as well as a divine figure. The literature and art of the New Age also reflected this change. The pessimistic literature, born from the despair of the collapse, continued to be copied and read, serving as a cautionary tale. The art, while returning to a unified royal style, retained a new sense of realism and human emotion that was absent from the serene, idealized art of the Old Kingdom. The famous statues of Middle Kingdom pharaohs often show them with careworn, brooding expressions, the faces of men who carried the weight of a difficult history. The long road to recovery was complete, but the journey had changed the destination. Egypt was whole again, but it was a different kind of whole. It was stronger in some ways, more resilient and pragmatic, but it had also lost the supreme, unshakable confidence of its youth. The memory of the apocalypse, of the time when the gods were silent and the river failed and brother fought against brother, would become a permanent part of its story. It is a powerful testament to the resilience of the Egyptian people and their culture that they were able to pull themselves back from the brink. Many other civilizations in the ancient world collapsed and never recovered, but Egypt did. It endured its darkest century and emerged, battered and bruised, to build a new golden age. The journey through the darkness had been long and terrible, but it had, in the end, led to a new dawn. And so we come to the end of our journey through the dust and despair of Egypt's forgotten apocalypse. We have walked through the ruins of a civilization that believed itself to be eternal, a kingdom built on the bedrock of divine order. And we have watched that bedrock crumble into sand. The fall of the Old Kingdom was not a single cinematic event. There was no one great battle, no single villain, no final dramatic scene. It was something far more terrifying, a slow, agonizing, multi-generational slide into anarchy. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a perfect storm of converging catastrophes. It began with the quiet, merciless betrayal of the climate, the failure of the one thing they could always trust, the river. This environmental shock then exposed every hidden weakness in their society, pulling at the threads of their political, religious, and social fabric until the whole magnificent tapestry unraveled. It's a grim reminder that even the mightiest pyramid rests on a foundation of mud, and if the mud dries up, the pyramid will fall. What makes this story so compelling, so haunting, is that it is a forgotten apocalypse. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the serene power of the Sphinx, and the geometric perfection of the Great Pyramids at Giza. We picture a civilization of supreme confidence and eternal stability. But we rarely picture this, the century of chaos that lies between the glory of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, a dark age hidden in the shadow of the pyramids. Let us retrace the steps of this collapse one last time. It all began with the water. The failure of the Nile floods, driven by a sudden and severe period of global climate change, was the catalyst. The lifeblood of the nation ceased to flow, and the black land, the fertile ribbon of life, turned to dust. This was not just an agricultural crisis, it was a theological one. The entire legitimacy of the state was built on the pharaoh's divine ability to guarantee the flood. And so, the second pillar of the state crumbled. Faith. The god-king, the living Horus, the son of Ra, was revealed to be powerless. His rituals were empty, his prayers went unanswered, the divine contract was breached. The people looked to their king for salvation and saw only a man as helpless as they were. This loss of faith in the central divine authority of the pharaoh was the internal rot that doomed the kingdom. With the failure of the harvest and the failure of faith came the third and most visceral stage of the apocalypse, famine. We've heard the grim stories from the texts from the bones, the gnawing, relentless hunger that leveled all social classes, the desperation that led people to eat weeds, leather, and even each other, the great Egyptian diet plan, where the only thing on the menu was misery. It was a biological catastrophe that hollowed out the nation from the inside. And where famine goes, its grim companion, disease, is never far behind. The weakened, malnourished bodies of the populace became a breeding ground for sickness. The contaminated, stagnant Nile became a vector for death. The crowded, unsanitary camps of displaced people became hotbeds of infection. This was the silent, invisible killer that added yet another layer of suffering to the already unbearable reality of daily life. As the bodies of the people weakened, so too did the body politic. The central government, now bankrupt and illegitimate, lost all control. Into this power vacuum stepped the ambitious provincial governors, the Nomarks. They seized control of local resources, raised private armies, and carved out their own petty kingdoms from the corpse of the nation. The unified state of the old kingdom shattered into a mosaic of warring fiefdoms. This fragmentation led directly to the next stage of the collapse, civil war. The Pax Egyptiaca, the great peace of the Pyramid Age, was replaced by a century of brutal, localized conflict. Brother fought against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The land was consumed by a turf war on a national scale, a violent and chaotic struggle to see who would be king of the ruins. The ideal of a unified Egypt was drowned in a river of blood. The cultural consequences were just as profound. The grand national project of pyramid building ground to a halt. The quarries fell silent. The skills and organization required for such feats were lost. Instead of building for eternity, the Egyptians were now focused on the desperate needs of the present. The old tombs, once sacred, were now seen as storehouses of treasure to be plundered for their wealth. The desecration of the dead was the ultimate sign that all rules were broken. And through it all, the people wept. We can still hear their voices in the pessimistic literature that this era produced. We hear the sage Epidemic lamenting the chaos and chiding his silent king. We hear the despair of the man arguing with his own soul about whether life is even worth living. These texts are the emotional scars of the apocalypse, a testament to the deep trauma inflicted upon the Egyptian psyche. They were a people forced to write a new, much darker story about themselves. The recovery, as we have seen, was not quick. It was a slow, 100-year grind. It took generations of warfare for the ambitious lords of Thebes to finally claw their way to the top, crush their rivals, and forcibly reunite the two lands. But the Egypt they rebuilt was a different nation. It was warier, more cynical, and more realistic. It carried the memory of the darkness in its cultural DNA. The supreme confidence of the old kingdom was gone, and it would never fully return. And so we are left with this grim but vital lesson from the ancient past, a lesson that no civilization, no matter how powerful, wealthy, or divinely ordained, is immune to collapse. Order is a fragile construction. Prosperity can be fleeting, and the environment is a partner that can, at any time, decide to revoke the terms of the deal. The story of the old kingdom's fall is a 4,000-year-old cautionary tale that still resonates today. It is the story of a civilization built on a single, brilliant, but dangerously fragile idea, the idea of the God King. They placed all their faith in a single point of failure, and when that point failed, the entire system imploded. It's a story about what happens when the center cannot hold, and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. It's a story of a people who reached for the stars, and for a time, held them in their hands, only to watch them burn out and fall to earth. So, as you drift towards sleep, lulled by this tale of ancient misery, perhaps spare a final thought for the people who lived through it. Remember the silent screams of those who watched their world dissolve into dust, who prayed for a flood that never came, and who looked for salvation from a Pharaoh who just wasn't there. It is a stark reminder that history is not just about the grand monuments of the powerful, but also about the quiet suffering of the forgotten. May your own leaders always be competent, and may your own rivers, wherever they may be, remain reliably wet. We have journeyed through a dark and distant past, a time of profound chaos and despair. But it is a past from which we can learn, a mirror in which we can see the faint reflections of our own anxieties and vulnerabilities. Thank you for listening tonight, for joining us on this tour of Egypt's forgotten apocalypse. We hope this dreadful history has been a soothing balm for your busy mind. Now dim the lights, forget the famines and the wars, and let the silence of the fallen pyramids guide you into your own peaceful oblivion. May your dreams be tranquil, and your history lessons, from now on, profoundly and comfortably dull.